We all like to laugh, right? I mean, everyone likes to laugh. You like to laugh. I like to laugh. The adopted and foster children and teenagers that we live with and work with, for the most part, they like to laugh too. And I know sometimes it can be very tough to get them to crack a smile, but for the most part, we as human beings, we love to laugh. And that's why today we're going to talk about what does it look like to connect with adopted and foster children and teenagers with humor, with laughter, with smiles. And it can be harder than some people think. I mean, we've all had those situations where we tried to kind of crack a joke or make someone laugh and it just completely bombed. And so today what we're going to try to help you do is learn to cultivate that positive, healthy, safe, appropriate, fun sense of humor while simultaneously maybe avoiding certain other types of humor that might not be beneficial to our adopted and foster children and teenagers. I think we're going to have a lot of fun doing this. Hopefully, we'll even laugh a few times over the next few minutes as we talk about what does it look like to connect through humor. Well, welcome to Replanted Conference 2021, the virtual edition. Or maybe you attended the live event and now you're going back and rewatching some of the virtual content, or maybe you couldn't attend the live event and now you're watching the virtual content. Whatever it is, welcome to Replanted 2021. We're so glad to have you here, or have you there, out there. I'm here, you're there. My name is ArthurCWoods, and just to tell you a quick little snippet of myself, my wife and I have been married for about 21 years. She and I in the past have been foster parents. We've been CRR treatment parents. She and I were case managers at a residential treatment facility for teenagers with pretty extreme behavioral disorders. I was a youth pastor for about 10 years. I served as a CASA, a court-appointed special advocate, for a little while. And now what I do is teenage life and productivity counseling. You know, life coaching's been around for many, many years, and it's only been kind of in recent years that people were starting to think, you know what, my teenager needs some coaching too, whether it's at school, whether it's at home, at work, or just in life in general. So as a life coach, I work with middle school and high school students in a one-on-one virtual environment to help them just improve their performance at school, improve family relationships, gain higher self-esteem, achieve greater success, just kind of in life in general. To think more positively, that's a huge one. We want our teenagers to be thinking more positively. I help them set important goals and achieve those important goals. I help them stay organized. I help them get motivated and really just help them with whatever it is they need at that time. If you live with or work with a teenager who might be able to benefit from some coaching, please go ahead and visit our website. I can set up a free consultation call with you and with the teenager, and we can talk about what it would look like for me to provide some one-on-one virtual coaching sessions. Okay, enough about that. Let's talk about why we're here, humor. Okay, so as we enter into a conversation about humor, I think it's important to remember that the adopted and foster children and teenagers that we live with and work with, whether because of their age, because of their background, their experiences, because of their trauma, they don't necessarily interpret humor in the same way perhaps you and I might. So it becomes important that as we use humor, that we kind of have an understanding of here's the type of humor that may work with this kind of population, and here's the type of humor that won't. So over the next few minutes, what I want to do is kind of go over the 5 do's of humor as it relates to interacting with our kids, and then the 5 don'ts of humor, again, as it relates to interacting with adopted and foster children and teenagers. So here's the first don't, if you will. Don't be sarcastic. I mean, that's a tough one, right? There's definitely some of you watching this, and I include myself in this, that love being sarcastic, right? I mean, it is just, for some of us, sarcasm is our greatest love language. I don't know if that's exactly approved by Gary Chapman in his book, but I think sarcasm is probably a love language. The problem is sarcasm, number one, can come across very negative and even hurtful sometimes, but beyond that, a lot of our adopted and foster children and teenagers, they don't translate the sarcasm. They don't understand the sarcasm. You say something being completely sarcastic, completely joking, not meaning anything by it, and they might interpret that information very literally and very honestly. And I've had that experience many, many times where sarcasm has been the thing that has hurt a relationship between me and someone else as opposed to brought us together. For many of us, when we think about sarcasm, we think about this guy.
Call her. Stop being so testosterone-y.
Which, by the way, is the real San Francisco treat. I got her machine.
Her answering machine?
No, interestingly enough, her leaf blower picked up.
That's right, if you don't know, that is Chandler Bing from the old school sitcom Friends. I bet we have some Friends fans out there. Chandler was notorious for being sarcastic, and he made us laugh a whole lot. Many people consider Chandler to be the funniest person on the show, and I'm sure we could argue about that for the next hour as to whether or not that's actually true. All I'm saying is some people find Chandler to be the funniest, but he is known to be sarcastic. And so our first caution, our first don't, is don't be sarcastic. And I'm not saying sarcasm is fundamentally wrong, but I am saying that for many of our adopted and foster children and teenagers, sarcasm is not the way to connect with them. Okay, don't number 2, don't be cynical. I'll be honest, a few years ago, several years ago, this was really tough for me. I was a very, very cynical person. I was very negative, I was very pessimistic, and I wasn't afraid to speak those things out toward people, or speak it out into the environment. In fact, I had a mantra that I lived with for a number of years, which you don't get too much more cynical than this. Here was the mantra: expect the worst and you'll never be disappointed. Expect the worst and you'll never be disappointed. And I know some of you might say, well, isn't there some truth in that? Cynicism isn't about whether or not there's truth in what you believe. Cynicism really is about just having a negative outlook on life. You know, a lot of pessimistic people will say, I'm not pessimistic, I'm a realist. In fact, I'll be honest, I have said that on more than one occasion. But the reality is, pessimists, cynics, these people who are very cynical like I was, we're very negative. And negativity is no way to live a life. And then we incorporate that negativity into our humor, and we start doing cynical humor. In fact, a good example of this might be, remember the old show on Fox, Dr. House, MD? One of the most cynical people, or at least one of the most cynical characters on television that you'll ever run across. I mean, he couldn't speak without being cynical about the situation that they were discussing. And while maybe I was never as bad as Dr. House, I would have to admit that I've had my share of cynicism over the year. And then we kind of package that with humor, and we start telling cynical jokes, and we start telling jokes that are very negative trending and pessimistic trending. And we do that with our adopted and foster children and teenagers. They're going to pick up on that negativity. They're going to embrace that negativity and make it part of our own. And I think as parents or social workers or youth workers or whoever you are, my guess is you don't want to cultivate negativity and cynicism in the lives of the children and the teenagers that you live with and work with. So my encouragement to you, avoid the cynical humor. I know it can be tough, but I would just encourage you to avoid it. Avoid the sarcastic humor, avoid the cynical humor. And number 3, avoid the inappropriate humor. And I know that one might sound obvious. Some of you might be thinking, why would I make inappropriate jokes with the adopted or foster child or teenager that I live with or work with? And I think the tendency is, as we develop a relationship with that child or that teenager, we also develop a comfort level with them, and we start thinking, well, maybe I can make this joke or make this comment. The reality is, we don't know their entire past. We don't know their entire trauma history. We don't know if one single inappropriate joke might just trigger something in them that my guess is you don't want to trigger in them. If they have been a victim of inappropriate talk or actions, behaviors before, they might not be comfortable with hearing inappropriate jokes. Now, I might also add to that, I don't know that telling inappropriate jokes is really a great thing to do in any situation, but certainly with our population of adopted and foster children and teenagers, you're probably going to want to stay away from telling jokes that would be deemed inappropriate. That could be jokes of a sexual nature, that could be jokes of a violent nature. Even potty humor sometimes can really go up to that line of being inappropriate, and you just never know what could trigger one of these adopted or foster children or teenagers. And again, I don't think any of you, or certainly not me either, want that to happen. Okay, so here's the next one. Don't be over their heads. Don't be over their heads. Have you ever had that person in your life who their level of humor is kind of so up there, so like intellectual or academic or heady somehow that you rarely even understand what they're talking about? In fact, I'll give you an example of this. One of the classic comic strips that was probably one of the funniest comic strips ever, but was also one of the most challenging comic strips to interpret, was The Far Side. Remember The Far Side? I used to love The Far Side, and I would say I got the majority of the jokes that were made in The Far Side, but there were always that collection of jokes that I just didn't understand. In fact, check this one out. Cow tools. Cow tools, that's all we know. There's a picture of a cow with some tools. There's a barn in the background. These apparently are cow tools. How many of you find this absolutely hilarious? Well, I don't know that I do. I'm not sure I even get it. Maybe one of you or two of you sitting there like, I totally get it, and it's hilarious. But my guess is most of us are sitting here kind of like thinking like, I don't really, maybe it's funny, maybe I get it, but I don't. And The Far Side was great at that. And The Far Side was great at making us laugh. It was great at making us think, but it was also great at making us kind of sit back and say, I'm not sure I even understand what is being said here. So my encouragement to you is, don't be over their heads. Don't have that sense of humor where you're making a joke and they have no idea what you're talking about because they have no point of reference to what you're referring to, or they don't know the information necessary to know to even find that joke funny. So don't be over their heads. Don't be sarcastic. Don't be cynical. And yeah, don't be over their heads. Okay, the next one is this. Don't be irrelevant. And this is a tough one for some of us old guys who grew up watching Seinfeld and think that it is the world's greatest, funniest sitcom ever to hit the airways. And in fact, it very well might be. Of course, I'm also a big fan of The Office, so I kind of do battle it out a little bit as to which one is better, Seinfeld or The Office. You probably have your opinions. And one of my favorite characters in Seinfeld is this guy.
Very good. Very good. You know something? No soup for you! Come back 1 year. Next!
Now, is that just funny stuff? Of course it is. Would your average Gen Z child or teenager have any idea what you're talking about if you reference the soup Nazi? Probably not. Unless you're really good parents and you forced your kids to watch every season of Seinfeld, then You deserve Parent of the Year award for doing that. Most of us have not made our kids watch Seinfeld though, so if you reference the soup Nazi, they're not going to have any idea what you're talking about. It becomes irrelevant to them. Hey, it may not be irrelevant to me and you. The soup Nazi, it's still relevant for us, but to them, it might be completely irrelevant. So my encouragement, just avoid humor that's going to be completely irrelevant to what they're going through, to what their understanding is. So those are kind of the 5. Don't be sarcastic, don't be cynical, don't be inappropriate, don't be over their heads, and don't be irrelevant. I think if you're careful to kind of avoid those 5 areas of humor, I think you'll find that you'll be able to connect a little better with the adopted and foster children and teenagers that you live with and that you work with. You know, as parents, as social workers, as counselors, as youth pastors, one of the biggest things that we can learn is how to connect better with the children and teenagers that we live with and that we work with. And humor is only a small part, is only one way in which we can connect, but it can become a very important way. So now that we've talked about some of the 5 don'ts of humor, let's actually talk about some of the 5 do's. Let's talk about what does it look like to actually try to incorporate humor into your connecting principles with your adopted and foster children and teenagers. So we're going to talk about the 5 do's of humor. Okay, the first one is this: be encouraging. I wish we lived in a more encouraging society, a more encouraging world. So often with our talk, with our communication, and certainly with our humor, it's very discouraging. Humor is often used to put someone down. But what if we intentionally used our humor as a form of encouragement? What would it look like if we were really intentional about using humor, about using jokes, about using comedy to build our kids up, to make them feel encouraged by a joke, as opposed to putting them down or putting someone around them down? Now that's harder to do. It's harder to come up with humor that is encouraging because it's really, really, really easy to come up with humor that puts someone down. But what if it was one of your missions that, you know what, when I make a joke, I'm gonna use that as a way to encourage my adopted or foster child or teenager. What could that look like? It might revolutionize things in your home. It might revolutionize the relationship you have with your kid. Okay, number 2, be clear that you were joking. Be clear that you were joking. I remember a number of years ago, we had a teenager come into our house and she needed a place to stay for a while. And it was just the first night she had stayed with us. And the following morning we were sitting down for breakfast and I made just kind of a dumb joke about, well, I hope you enjoyed your first day with us because we're kicking you out on the street now. Okay, number 1, probably a really dumb thing to say. But number 2, what I didn't realize in that exact moment is she didn't realize I was joking. She thought that that was a serious comment. And it wasn't until hours later when she mentioned that she was looking for a place to stay that night, I said, well, you can stay with us as long as you need. You know that, right? And she's like, no, you said that you were kicking me out to the curb. And I was like, oh, no. I said, I'm sorry. I said, I was just joking. That wasn't serious at all. Please, you're welcome to stay here as long as you need to stay here until we can get things situated. I was not at all clear with the fact that I was joking. In fact, my humor was pretty sarcastic too, and it did not help the relationship that I had with that teenager. So don't follow my example there. Be clear that you are joking. Okay, the next one is this: be intentional. And this can be a little hard because a lot of times humor just kind of comes to our head real quick and we spit it out before we even realize that it was in our head. And sometimes that can be good and funny and hilarious, and other times that can be one of those wah wah moments that we all hate where there's just kind of crickets chirping in the background. But be intentional with your humor as you're seeing a situation unfold. Are there ways that you can really come in, make a joke, be humorous, add some comedy to the situation that might help de-escalate the situation, that might help the child laugh, that might help you connect to that child. As I told you earlier, I was a case manager at a residential treatment facility for teenagers with behavioral issues. And I remember one day we had a teenage guy who was very, very highly escalated, very much off task, and was becoming very, very verbally and even physically aggressive toward the staff. And I remember walking into the room, and by this point he had already ripped his shirt off, was posturing the staff, and was ready to kind of throw down with the staff. And I remember walking into that room, and he and I made eye contact, and he and I had a good relationship for the most part. And I said, "Dude, why in the world is your shirt off? You're scaring all the lady staff." And that's all it took. He smiled, and in that moment, boom, he realized that his behaviors were being, well, less than appropriate. And he laughed, and I laughed, and the other staff laughed, and it was just that humor that was able to de-escalate him enough for us to be able to process with him and speak with him, and it ended up being a good situation. Now, I can't guarantee that comment would have de-escalated every single situation with every single child. It probably would not have, but because of the relationship I had with that child already, I knew that if I could get him to laugh, if I could connect with humor with him, we could de-escalate the situation very quickly, and in that case, it worked. Now, that said, I have also seen many staff members in those situations try to connect with humor, and it go horribly, horribly wrong. Probably escalated the situation more than de-escalated. So you have to be intentional. You have to use your best guesses as to what to say and what to do and how humor might be able to help a situation, and understand that sometimes humor may not be able to help the situation. Okay, the next one is this: be careful. And in some ways, be careful encapsulates everything that we're talking about today. But be careful. Humor is such an amazing tool that we have in our toolbox to use to connect with our adopted and foster children and teenagers. But it can also go really bad. We can make a joke at the wrong time, or we can make the wrong joke, or we can make a joke to the wrong person. And next thing you know, we've really hurt the relationship with the child or the teenager that we were trying to connect with. And it's not one of those things that we can always know 100% how a child or teenager is going to react to us trying to infuse humor into a situation. Many times, they're not in a joking mood. They don't want to have any kind of lighthearted humor infused into the situation, and we have to be aware of that. Sometimes humor may not be the way to connect at that moment. So we have to be careful. We have to say, what's my relationship with this child? Let's take a look at the situation. How are they likely to respond if I make a joke or if I try to infuse humor in some way, shape, or form? And be careful. And you might end up finding out, you know what, in this situation for right now, humor may not be the way to go. Okay, and the last one is this: be funny. Okay, now that sounds really weird. In our conversation about using humor, you would think, well, isn't it obvious that you should be funny? Hopefully, maybe that's obvious that you should be funny, but I gotta tell you, not everyone has a forte of being hilarious. Okay, there are some people in this world that are just so funny. They could get the grumpiest person on the planet to break out into hysterics. And then there are some people, and I'm sure it's none of you, but there are some people that wouldn't know a joke if it punched them right in the face. You kind of need to be aware of what is your ability to even use humor. How good are you with jokes or joking around or infusing humor into situations? And honestly, if you say to yourself, I'm so not funny. Every time I try humor, it goes poorly. Every time I tell a joke, there's just crickets. I just have no grasp of humor. First of all, that is okay. That doesn't make you a bad parent or a bad youth worker or counselor or whatever. But it might mean, hey, you know what? Humor may not be a tool in my toolbox that I want to use too frequently. In fact, if I looked at my toolbox in my garage, there I could pull out a hammer and I'd be like, yeah, I could probably use this tool. I'm okay with a hammer. But I bet there's some tools in there that I don't even know what they're called. I've never used them, and I probably shouldn't use them. That doesn't mean I'm a bad person. That just means this particular tool, maybe I shouldn't use too often, or at least I should learn how to use it. So my final do of humor is be funny. So the 5 do's of humor: be encouraging, be clear that you're joking, be intentional, be careful, and be funny. Okay, so before I kind of wrap up our time together, I did want to let you know about one resource that we have available called Trusting the God of the Gospel. And if you're not familiar with this, it's a DVD video series that we put out back in 2019, and it's designed to help parents, youth workers, Christian counselors talk to adopted and foster teenagers about God. The premise is this: adopted and foster teenagers have experienced trauma, and that trauma has affected what they believe about God, about faith, about Christianity, about Jesus. And so we take a look at what are those gospel concepts or those biblical words or ideas that might be kind of a barrier to adopted and foster teenagers because of what they've been through in their past. And we talk about what are ways that we can present the gospel without changing the gospel, but what are ways that we can present the gospel to a child who has been traumatized in a way that becomes more palatable to them. For example, if a child had a horrible experience with a biological father when they were growing up, it might be difficult for them to embrace the gospel concept that God is their heavenly Father. So with the understanding of their past, how do we present the gospel? And so the series goes through about 8 to 10 different gospel concepts that are typically difficult for adopted and foster teenagers to embrace, and shows you how to be able to kind of communicate those to the teenagers. There's a downloadable PDF workbook that comes along with it that has exercises, that has discussion questions, personal reflection questions, scripture memorization, and it's really designed to help you as a parent or a youth worker or a Christian counselor to be able to disciple the adopted and foster teenagers that you live with and work with. If that's something you're interested, head on over to trustingthegodofthegospel.com. You can get all the information right there. Okay, so let's wrap up our time together. Humor, you love it, I love it, our kids love it. It can be such an amazing way to connect with the adopted and foster children and teenagers that are in our care. Use it intentionally, but just be careful with it. Humor can be such an amazing way to connect, but if we're not careful, it can also be an absolute train wreck. It can hurt the relationship that we have with the child or the teenager instead of helping it. So what is that going to look like for you? After you're finished watching this video, at some point in the near future, you're going to interact with an adopted or foster child that you live with or work with. How are you going to connect through humor? How are you going to use laughter as a way to bring each other together? How are you going to be intentional with comedy and jokes and smiling and laughter and humor to be able to help that child connect better with you? It's such an amazing tool. It's one of many tools that you have access to. And it can also be one of the most fun tools because, again, everybody loves to laugh. And connecting through humor can be such an amazing way to connect with the adopted and foster children and teenagers that you live with and that you work with. Replanted 2021, thank you so much for your time. I hope you found this valuable. I hope you enjoyed this time, and I hope you can go out and make some kids laugh. Thanks.